Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we are going to be running through every single card in the standard ban list to give an explanation of how these cards ended up on the ban list and why they're not considered okay to be played in the standard format. Huge shout out has to go to Zach Greenwald, who suggested this video idea in a YouTube comment. I read that and I thought it was a great idea and it's probably going to be a lot of fun. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, there is something called the standard ban list. And these are the lists of cards that you're not allowed currently to play in the standard format. It's worth noting that I'm recording this on September 9th, just before an expected change to the standard ban list. And while I think there's going to be some interesting changes before Worlds, I hope most of this, the historical context part, will still be accurate. So if you don't know what the standard ban list, these are the list of cards that you're not allowed to play in organized play in Netrunner in the standard format. If you don't know what that is, if you want to go to Nisei.net and up here at the Players tab, you go down to Supported Formats, you can see the list of cards, the card pool of the standard format. It is all the Nisei cards plus the last 2-3 years of Fantasy Flight Games products. Standard has classically been the biggest format. It's the format that Worlds, Championship, Continentals, all this sort of organized play happens at. Mind you, Startup is still a really cool format. There is going to be a Startup tournament at Worlds. But there is, specifically for standard format, there is a pretty large ban list. These are cards that are just banned and you can't bring to any sort of standard tournament. It's interesting. Currently, the standard ban list is curated by just being a ban list. But throughout the history of Netrunner, organized play has actually taken many attempts to try and balance and make sure that the Netrunner standard meta has been fun and heterogeneous and interesting in many different ways. This all started back, I believe it was the last day of 2015, December 31st. I remember this clearly. It was in holiday season, and Fantasy Flight Games at the time introduced something they called the NAPD Most Wanted list. That was a fun in-flavor universe name, but what they did is they targeted certain cards and assigned these cards what was called universal influence. So that looks like this, where they highlighted about 12 different cards, and if you wanted to play these cards in any deck, including the deck of which the cards are in faction, for each copy of each card, you would have to play an additional influence. So if you wanted to play the Criminal Consul Desperado in Criminal, it would cost you still an extra influence. So this became a way to try and balance it out. So it was harder to include all these cards in your deck. And on top of that, still bring things in from other factions. This was to some extent a success. There were still a lot of decks that just treated these lists as a shopping list. So in some ways it worked, in other ways it just highlighted what you should be playing. But later on, I think it was a couple years later, in 2017, again, at near the end of the year, they upgraded and they changed what this list looked like. They dropped the sort of universal influence system and they moved over to a restricted and a removed format. Removed cards are what they are now today, banned cards, but there were also restricted cards. And restricted cards were a certain subset of cards that if you wanted to play any amount of copies of any of the named restricted cards, you could not play any of the other restricted cards. The idea is that if you wanted to play Aesop's Pawn Shop in your deck, you also couldn't play Clone Chip. Same idea, trying to limit the power value or the power limit of certain cards to make sure they weren't showing up everywhere and to also break up certain combos that were deemed a bit too oppressive. Now, Nisei has changed this, and this actually went on for a while. Nisei still had a restricted and ban list for a fair bit, but I believe it was 2020, in the summer of 2020, Nisei updated their Most Wanted list. They changed this to what they call now the ban list and made it just a ban-only format. That's what it looks like today, and it's very simple to understand if you're playing standard. You just look at the list of cards, Netrunner DB will warn you as well, and you just can't play them. You don't worry about restricted cards, you don't worry about universal influence. It's definitely the simplest, technically a less granularity from the balance team for tools and levers to play with, but it's very straightforward. There are still a lot of players that refer to the ban list as the Most Wanted list as a holdover from like 6-7 years ago, myself included sometimes, but that's just because that's what it used to be called. And this is currently the ban list. We're going to be running through every single card to tell you, talk to you why these cards ended up on this list. This page, mind you, is very interesting. If you go to the Netrunner DB, at the top under More, you can find the ban list page, and this gives you the list. This list is strange because while this list is technically accurate, this also has a lot of cards that are rotated. So this list is accurate. All the cards on here are banned, but there's also extra cards that are not even in the standard format, so you don't have to worry about it. So while this looks intimidating, it's actually a fair bit fewer cards than this. But let's jump into this. Again, there are not exactly timestamps for this video because I don't think you're allowed to put 55 timestamps on a YouTube video, but we will divide Runner and Corp if you want to jump into that. And of course, if you like this content, give a like or subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow. Let's start at the top. This is 24/7 news cycle. This is an NBN operation. It costs 0, but the real cost of this card is the agenda that you had to forfeit. When you play this operation, you get to trigger the when scored ability on a scored agenda in your score area. And that is a very, very powerful card, but it was a very niche card that was very powerful in a certain deck. And that was the style of decks that were very popular in 2016. This is Dean's Yellow Railgun deck. To understand what this deck did, it worked very well with one of the strongest NBN agendas of all time, Breaking News. A 2-1 agenda is really easy to score. It's hard for the runner to interact with that. And when scored, it gives the runner 2 tags. Now, these tags are lost at the end of the turn, so the runner is not going to have to clear these. But the idea is that this deck wanted to score out a Breaking News as soon as possible. Then in the next couple turns, they would try and score out another agenda, maybe a second Breaking News, very easy to score. And then they would play the 24/7 news cycle to forfeit an agenda to give the Breaking News when scored ability to trigger that again to give the runner 2 tags. Once the runner had 2 tags, they just boomed him. And that was it. This deck could score or kill, they could win very consistently on like turn 4, turn 5, because it's very easy to score some of these NBN agendas, and this would come out of nowhere. This deck also had some combo opportunities to get some, you could play double boom in a turn, you could score multiple agendas. This one was weird, but a more straightforward version of this was Bayoken. This is Ben Nee's list that came in second at Worlds of 2016. Huge shout out to Bayoken, who was one of my favorite Netrunner content creators back in the day. Check out his channel. It's still pretty good if you want to see some old Netrunner. But same idea, this deck, Breaking News, 24/7 news cycle, straight into boom, and it was powerful. You could flatline runners out of nowhere very quickly in the game, and runners had to deal with this. Runners in the competitive meta understood that this archetype was very prevalent, and you saw that people were addressing this. You had cards like Plastic Carapace showing up pretty consistently, a boring card from the first data pack of all Netrunner that just allowed you to prevent 4 meat damage. That could help you. That could be the difference of not dying on turn 5. On top of that, we had New Angeles City Hall to dodge tags. And this was the sort of idea, is that this tag was very prevalent, that the runner meta had to adjust to this. And so this card eventually got banned because a lot of people thought it wasn't very fun. Some of these decks just came out to, did you draw your tech card soon enough to not die out of nowhere? And 24/7 news cycle hit the ban block. This is one of the few cards that I think could come back and be unbanned currently, because there's not a lot of cards like Breaking News that are very, very potent with this. The cost of forfeiting an agenda is a really strong cost. So you don't want to really on-tempo forfeit an agenda just to get a win scored like Artificial Crypto Crash. You generally want to do this with an agenda that you can leverage the win scored ability on command to actually win the game. So I think you might be looking at things like Armed Intimidation, a really niche Wayland agenda that can give the runner 2 awkward choices, whether they take the 5 meat damage or the 2 tags, which again, boom can happen. But this is also a lot harder to set up because you still need to score this agenda and another agenda and still set up some things. It's just nowhere near as consistent as the old Breaking News decks. On top of that, maybe NBN could do something with re-education to make sure the runner has no hand size so they can get an easy flatline. And then I think Jinteki has a lot of options with cards like Sting. I'm not actually sure if Sting works because it doesn't exactly say when scored on it. It's a bit more nuanced than when a player scores. I don't know if it works, but that's a large idea that I think 24/7 news cycle could potentially come back. And we'll see if there's just certain agenda suites that really, really make this a scary threat. Speaking of scary threats, we have a couple Jinteki cards that largely all got banned together. Not exactly banned together in time. I think a couple of these got banned first and then later on more bans happened, but they all showed up together in the same sort of archetype. And that is an archetype that is generally called a grinder archetype or a potato archetype, which is a fun name. This is Jinteki Potential Unleashed, one of the Megacorp identities, the 12 influence identities that came out during the Flashpoint cycle after the financial collapse in the FFG lore. And this card said, when the runner takes at least 1 net damage whenever, they also have to trash the top card of their stack. There's a lot of decks right now in Jinteki that are actually trying to flatline the runner by playing some amount of traps that if you run or don't run, they can hurt you. But these sort of Potential Unleashed decks were doing something different. They were not trying to flatline the runner. They were trying to make the runner just run out of cards. They were grinding the runner down. Every single net damage is twice as effective, and it just became a matter of hit points. You didn't actually see a lot of flatlines where the runner took more damage than cards in hand, but you saw that in like 10, 15 turns, they just had no deck left. And at that point, they couldn't run anymore because a single point of net damage would end them. And so that's the idea with these decks. This is the Comrades Potato deck that came in very well at Worlds. There was many top finishes with this deck. And you see not only the exclamation marks here of cards that are banned, but you can maybe see what the idea of this deck was. This deck never wanted to build a remote server. This was the sort of prison deck where they just iced up all centrals and just clicked for credits. A lot of times the best line in this deck was install credit. And you had to play very quickly because these games went on very long, because you didn't have a very strong win condition. It all depended on the runner losing cards. And so this deck just ran so many ways to do at least one single net damage, barring too much interaction. You would Neural EMP, and now your Neural EMP does 2 damage, 1 from hand, 1 from the top of the deck. You would archive memories these over and over again. You also ran cards like Hokusai Grid, so if the runner ran a server, they would have to take, again, what turns out to be 2 net damage. And he played a lot of Mean Ice that did a lot of net damage. We'll talk about some of the other cards. But this deck basically just iced up all central servers, click for credits until the runner eventually ground themselves out. There was other really strong win conditions attached to this, but this sort of archetype, even through bans, mind you, at this point, the ID, Potential Unleash, was banned. The same archetype still existed. We're just playing in Personal Evolution, so it's a bit slower, but it still existed. And people found this to be not very fun. To explain what else this deck did, you strapped on 3 Kakugos on all your central servers. This card also now is currently banned. It was recently unbanned for Worlds last year. It is now rebanned again, but the same idea. It's an ice on a central server that if you want to get through, you have to take damage, which puts runners on the clock. Every axis could easily be 2 damage, which becomes 4 damage with Potential Unleashed, and you only have 45 hit points at the beginning of a game if you are not installing any of your cards. So the amount of accesses you can get before the game is over is really slow, and the deck had a hard agenda suite to steal 7 points and interact with. This was also a very important card in the archetype, Shipment from Tenon. This says if the runner didn't run, for 1 click you can put 2 advancements on a single card. So the idea with this is that the runner is not running because they're preserving cards in hand because they can't afford to run every single turn. You can install a card like House of Knives, advance it, and then Shipment from Tenon it, and get a fast advance House of Knives. And now in Potential Unleashed, this is 6 more damage. So if they're not running, you're fast advancing, and you're trying to just get the runner to the point where they do not have enough cards to be able to steal an Obokata Protocol off the table at the end of the game. They just don't have cards, they can't run, and you've won. And unfortunately, this was done by just installing guys, clicking for credits, and telling the runner, you're going to have to run at some point, and I'm going to do enough damage before you can get to 7. And people did not like this. It was a very competitive deck, and even modernly, it's a very competitive deck. Sokka recently, a couple months ago, won the US Nationals with Sort of List. I know I played this Sort of List at a store championship and won it earlier this summer, and that was because Kakugo was unbanned, same as Shipment from Tenon, just for this last fall and the summer. It is now currently banned again. Another important card in this list is Breach Dome, a card that also interacts similarly, doesn't interact with, but a similar idea to Potential Unleashed. When the runner accesses, they take a meat damage. That's kind of weird for Jinteki, but they also trash the top card of their stack. And this is another thing that I don't like about Breach Dome and I didn't like about Potential Unleashed, is that a lot of times when you're playing against a Jinteki deck that you're expecting net damage from, you're making intelligent decisions. Say that you're a criminal and you have 5 cards in hand, and one of them is a program that you know that if you lose this to net damage, it's going to be a problem because you don't have recursion. So a lot of times you'll install it, you'll pre-install it just to make sure that you can't lose it. Cards like Breach Dome and cards like Potential Unleashed that take damage off the top of the deck, you don't have that decision anymore. Sometimes you can just run, take a net damage, and off the top of your deck, lose a very important piece. So how do you play around that? A lot of times that means you have to draw more to ensure that you're not losing the cards randomly off the top of your deck that could have a huge impact on the game. And again, if you're drawing more, that kind of eats through the hit points that this deck is trying to capitalize on. Interesting thing about Breach Dome is that this sort of archives fires trap, and this is what you do with Breach Dome. You would throw them out into archives so the runner couldn't run archives easily. You could also throw agendas in archives to make them harder to steal. Is that this sort of ambush asset existed before in the game. We used to have shock, which was simply 1 net damage for each shock in archives if you hit it there. And I think a lot of people were expecting Restoring Humanity, the current Archives Matters Jinteki identity, to get a card like this. They don't currently have one. So we'll see if there's something like this that comes back. But all of these cards coming together made this sort of potatoes grinder list that just want to install something, click for 2 credits, and wait for you to run out of cards. A very competitive, but a very not fun identity. And so a lot of this stuff ended up getting banned out across the years. Currently, the archetype is just about dead. Next up, we have a Wayland upgrade. This is Brian Stinson, a character that if the runner has less than 6 credits, so 5 or less, you can use Brian's ability to spend a click to play a transaction that's in your archives, ignoring all costs. That means that if you have a hedge fund in archives, you can spend a click on Brian to get 9 credits for a click, because all costs means you don't have to pay the play cost of this thing. Is just a click for 9 credits. That's a massive amount of money. Now, Brian was fun. This is a maybe a bit too on the nose reference to Barney Stinson, Neil Patrick Harris's character from How I Met Your Mother. But this card was banned because it was way too swingy of a card. Firstly, On turn 1, the runner has less than 6 credits. So you could, if you wanted to, hedge fund, install Brian, res Brian, and then play the hedge fund again with Brian's ability. And you're going to start with a massive amount of money on turn 1. The runner can interact with that. And while money doesn't inherently matter that much, you've also not iced up your central servers, which is a real cost, or put anything on the board. This was a huge swing in the mid to late game if runners just didn't respect this. It was way too big of a swing. Because you saw cards like this. Government subsidies wasn't a legal card back then, but modernly, if the runner dips below 5 credits, and in a lot of games they do, when you force them to run and spend money, you can click for 15 credits. And that's just a bit too much of a very easy punishment card to put into your deck that made games very volatile. If you just went down to 5 credits instead of 6, and then suddenly the corporation has massive amounts of money, and specifically corporations, Wayland corporations, can leverage massive amounts of credit disparity between runners and corps. So this was not considered very fun and was banned out. The fact that Brian, I think, is currently banned is also pretty good for the design of the game, because Brian existing has an inherent design squeeze on what kind of transactions they can play. The fact that you could classically, and this is not a current standard card, play Ultraviolet Clearance for a single click to gain 10 credits on 4 cards shows you the power level of a card like this. You can't print good transactions regularly when Brian can exist and play them for free. So see you, Brian. Another Wayland upgrade, this is Kayambe Grid. This is a Nisei card. This is the first Nisei card to be banned from the standard format. And this was a defensive upgrade. It's not unique, it is a region, but when your turn begins, it allows you to put an advancement on a piece of ice in front of the server. When the runner approaches the server, they had to pay 2 credits for every ice in front of the server that had an advancement on it. And so this became an annoying upgrade. It's kind of like a Managarm Skunkworks with less choices for the runner, but can scale really well into the late game. This card also is not only a defensive upgrade, but it gives advancements on cards, which is something that Nisei has been really pushing with advanceable ice back through the history of the game, with cards like Wall to Wall came out alongside this. Important thing to know about Netrunner is that advanceable ice right now in Wayland is actually quite good, but historically it was bad. It was one of the things keeping Wayland to be not a competitive faction for the early years of Netrunner. There was some really bad advanceable ice. And that did change about 4 or 5 years into the history of Netrunner, where Wayland Ice, advanceable ice, just started to get good in general. This sort of ability to get free advancements has been more common now, and it's really good. Kayambe Grid, in fact, was banned, and Nisei had a cryptic message saying that there was something in testing that they saw that was just a bit too good, and they wanted to squash that deck before it showed up in standard format. So you don't actually see why this card is banned. I think a big reason that this card is a bit stronger than it might look is that it's not unique. A lot of the other defensive upgrades in this game are unique. So you can actually put one of these on every server that you want and get the free advancements and the defensive ability. But otherwise, I don't know. I don't actually like this card a lot. I think it's really boring. I find myself playing a lot into this because this is a card that is legal in the startup format. This, mind you, isn't a startup card, but a lot of times this will just go down in front of an ice that just gets infinite scaling the longer you leave this thing up. And so you really have to trash it early or things get out of control. I think the frustration for me is playing against a lot of Wayland decks and startup that don't run a lot of agendas and force all these advanceables to build these servers. And I don't think anyone's making big decisions, and it just becomes a bit of a grind of a game. So Kayambe Grid is banned. It's another card that I think could be unbanned in the standard format. There are more tools to deal with this. Cards like Pinhole Threading from Midnight Sun, Light the Fire from Midnight Sun, that stuff is really good. But we'll see, because classically, I don't know. I know a lot of people didn't love playing against advanceable ice and this sort of interaction, but maybe it could come back. Another Nisei card that got banned, this was one of the most recently banned cards in the last update in August. This is Cyberdeck Sandbox. And this is a 4-2 agenda that when scored allows you to purge virus counters, but the first time a turn you also purge virus counters, you get 4 credits for each sandbox scored. So on its own, you advance this up, you get a purge, you gain 4 credits. From then on, if your turn is click for credits as a corporation, you might as well purge, you get 1 more credit. And you can also start playing more virus-based hate cards, because anytime a purge goes on, even if the runner's not playing any viruses, you get good money. This is one of the tempo positive agendas from the neutral suite that were pretty ubiquitous for the last couple of years. And you'll see this agenda showed up everywhere. And I think that was the problem. It showed up a bit too much. This is no longer a legal deck in the standard format, but you see these sort of decks that are playing more 4-2 neutral agendas than they are playing the flavorful in-faction agendas, just because this sort of ability was really good. On top of that, I think this is the worst example of it, but this is the deck that won Worlds last year, and it's an HB deck, and it's only running a single HB agenda. Everything else is neutral. Like literally everything besides this agenda is neutral, which kind of shows you the power level, the ubiquity of the neutral agendas are very, very strong, and they're showing up everywhere. And that means that corp decks overall are getting a bit more homogenous. When every deck wants to run the same neutral agenda suite, your faction choice becomes a bit less interesting. Now, this card being banned, I think, has an impact on the meta, and we're seeing it a bit now. The fact that Cyberdeck Sandbox was everywhere had an impact on how many viruses runners would want to bring. Because there's a big chance if you're playing like an Amakua-based deck up here, you'll just run into a Sandbox deck, get purged out, and you lose so much tempo at the same time that the runner or the corporation is winning the game. So the fact that this is banned now, you're seeing a couple more viruses show up. Not that there weren't any virus decks back in the days of Cyberdeck Sandbox. I think the big winner right now is Tapworm. But we are seeing the effect of Cyberdeck Sandbox getting banned. There are corps that have less on-tempo agendas. I think the HB Precision Design deck is struggling to see which agenda fits this slot, but you're seeing some of the corp decks slow down a bit, which is good, but you're also seeing a bit more interesting and nuanced agenda suites across corp factions, which that's awesome. And very similarly, this is SSL Endorsement, a neutral 5/3 agenda that came out in the Katara cycle. This, you put 9 credits on it, and when it's either scored or stolen, you get to take 3 credits off of it at the beginning of each your turn. And this card was also just as ubiquitous, if not even more ubiquitous than Cyberdeck Sandbox back in its day. So corp decks are inherently pretty constrained of what they can play. A corp deck, you need to have agendas. You need to have enough agendas in your deck for it to be legal. You need to run enough economy. You need to run enough ice. And then you still need to figure out how to win the game on top of that. And Sandbox was such a good card because not only was it taking up a lot of the agenda slots in your deck, if you ran 3 of these, that's 9 agenda points that are, already solved, but it also is a massive economy card. This is the sort of agenda that you were actually excited when the runner stole it on turn 1, turn 2, because you knew your next 2 turns of 3 turns of economy issues are just largely solved. And so this became very, very popular. Interestingly, 5/3 agendas were not very common in Netrunner for a very long time. This was many years ago, but the Future Perfect was one of the first 5/3 agendas that corps really wanted to consider playing competitively because it is defensive. But having a 5/3 agenda in your deck means that the runner could win on as soon as 3 accesses. And SSL Endorsement was one of the few agendas that was now a very good neutral agenda that everyone could play. So you saw a lot more corp decks swapping in to play 5/3 based agenda suites. And this means there were a lot of decks that had only 7 agendas. This means that some of the games were longer, multi-access was much more important, and you saw there was a lot of decks that really benefited from having strong 5/3s. One of the best reasons, or one of the best users of this, was Asmari EdTech. That's the problem here, is this 40 minimum deck size. The same thing that you see in the system gateway corporations. The idea is with the 40 minimum deck size, if you're playing up to 44 cards, you only need 18 to 19 agendas. So a lot of these decks would only play 6 copies of 3-pointer agendas. So you'd run 3 SSL and then whatever your other good 3 NBN faction agenda is. And then the runner still had to steal half the agendas in your deck. You would play another non-agenda card to score out your last points. Stuff like Echo Chamber was pretty common. But these sort of decks started to be very common. And the existence of a very strong 5/3 agenda had a huge impact on how corps were building decks. You can see here, if you just search SSL, it's not like you see one faction more represented than the other. It was, again, just like Cyberdeck Sandbox everywhere. But the bigger problem is that it was making a lot more agenda suites, a lot more top heavy. And currently, Nisei has said that they don't like 5/3 agendas. They want to play a bit more smaller agendas, 4/2s, 3/2s, to ensure the game is a bit more dynamic. And there are more agendas and central servers for runners to steal. I think it's a more fun game overall. So SSL Endorsement has been banned for being a bit too ubiquitous, a bit too good too, just with the economy itself. But now again, we're seeing more agendas across decks. This is the beginning of an interesting conversation because there's an entire subtype of cards that is just blanket banned across runner and corp. And that is this term here, current. All the currents are currently banned. And so a lot of times the discussion is not so much what the text is on these cards. There's a fair few currents that are currently in the standard card pool that are banned. We're going to go through most of them, but no individual current is banned because of the text on them. They're banned as an idea as a whole. So if you don't know what currents are, these were a new type of card that were printed at the beginning of the lunar cycle. And so you see FFG here explains it. They were operations or events that were played. And instead of playing these and putting them into your archives or into your heap, they stayed on the table. And they had lasting game impacts until, if a corporation, you play the current, it stayed there until another current was played to replace it, or until the runner scored an agenda. And same on the corp side, or on the runner side, the runner current would stay until another current was played, or until the corp scored an agenda. That might have been a bit confusing, but in short, your card stayed on the table until your opponent did something. So the corp, you're basically saying, here's an ongoing effect. The only way you can turn it off is to play your own or to come at me and get an agenda. And here's where the conversation about currents begins. A lot of people had a lot of strong takes on this. Currents inherently they have a bit of a squeeze on the meta. If there are some very good currents on the runner or the corpse side, it really forces the other side of the table to consider playing currents in their deck, just to be able to turn off these abilities that are inherently hard to interact with. If I can play a current that's very strong on turn 1, and you don't have the counter current to dispel it, you're just hoping that you can win, or not win, but steal an agenda off the top of the deck, and sometimes that doesn't line up. Now you get some imbalances here where the certain factions have better access to certain currents, and that has an impact on the whole meta. But the idea was that these cards weren't too fun to play too often. These were banned at the same time where Nisei in 2020 changed to the ban list only format, and the write-up here I think is actually pretty interesting to see what they thought about this. So here at the all current events banned section, Nisei explains how they divided currents into 4 different sections. Firstly, there was currents that were played casually as counter currents, like Net Celebrity, the bad Shaper currents. There's also powerful effects that can change how the players interact, and they list a couple here. And I think these are the currents that most people actually ended up enjoying, that changed the board state, that didn't win the game when they were played, but you had to play around them. These were actually pretty fun. Then there were cards that had no counterplay inherently. You might be confused with this, but these were currents that were largely played akin to events or operation. You'd play the current and then do something that made the current actually do something on the same turn. And then finally, and this was the biggest category, not in terms of the cards that fell into this, but the amount of currents that were getting played mostly fell into this: answer or lose currents. Employee strike, scarcity resources, death and taxes, etc. We're going to show examples of this. Again, there are a lot of currents. I'm not going to show them back to back to back just so we can pepper it through the video. But that was kind of the problem here, is that you needed to deal with some of these very powerful currents. Otherwise, the game could be lost on the spot to something that was inherently difficult to interact with. On top of that, currents, because there only can be one current active, there was not a good incentive for runner decks or corp decks to run multiple kinds of currents in their list. So a lot of times a corp would just run the best current they had access to, because one of the worst things to have in your hand while you already have a current played is another current, right? You don't want to turn off your own current by playing your second current. So a lot of decks just played the best currents, and those were generally the ones that were answer or lose. And we're going to see what those look like. But the conversation on currents was always very long. Some people just wanted the worst currents, the answer or lose currents, to be banned, because some of the other currents were actually genuinely fun to play with. But as a whole, instead, the whole thing got banned, and I'm okay with that. It's a funny little artifact, though. There are currently still in the standard card pool cards that interact with currents but don't have currents to play with. New Angeles Soul is an identity that inherently cares about currents. It's actually a blank identity in the standard card pool, but you can bring this to a tournament and play with your blank 4515. Pretty fun. New Sound, kind of blank. It is technically a Trace 3 on his 4-strength sentry. That's fine. But it also was a good card back in the day, but currently you can play it without currents. Rough. And also Shadow Now, the next activation command, and these sort of lockdown operations. Some of these do see play in standard competitive play, but this was Nisei's way to kind of give you the same play space of currents, but they only last a single turn. They're cool. They're fun. Not all of them see a lot of play, but this is a more healthy idea of how currents could work. And this brings us back to death and taxes. The first current we're going to talk about. Nisei actually mentioned this as an answer or lose current. I was not as hot on this current. It is basically it's a 2-cost current, which is kind of expensive for a card that might disappear immediately next turn and not do anything. But it says whenever the runner installs a card or trashes an installed card, the corp gets a credit. So this inherently was a transaction card. And in some cases, this was an answer or lose. If you could not play your own current really quickly, if you could not steal an agenda off the top of R&D, this could give bucket loads of cash to the corporation. You saw at the time, a lot of shapers were very install heavy. Haley wants to install at least 2 cards a turn. You saw even just the normal cards most decks are playing end up trashing themselves, let alone people want to install their cards. So this made it difficult, and specifically in a faction that can also leverage a difference in credits. So Death and Taxes was an impactful card in some decks. Again, it wasn't that popular because, again, a lot of times Corps would just play the best current they had access to, and Death and Taxes in Wayland decks was often the second best current. But again, all currents are banned. Death and Taxes wasn't inherently problematic. The whole package was. This is another current. This is called Door to Door. 3 credits is the most expensive cost for a current. They were costed at 0 to 3 credits. And at the beginning of the turn, this forced a trace. A trace 1 is not a lot of a trace, but you'd either get a tag if the trace was successful, or you lost the trace as a runner. And if you're already tagged, instead you'd get a meat damage. They are knocking at your door. And this saw some niche play in a very mean prison deck. You'd have to be playing largely Making News because you needed those extra credits to boost to make this a trace 3 every turn. And the idea was that this deck ran a lot of other things to make those traces really ugly and kept the runner constantly tagged and traced, and they kept losing money off of this. It was a prison deck. It competitively did okay as like a tier 1.5, tier 2 niche deck, but it was entirely dependent on access to this current, which is now banned. Another current, Enforced Curfew. a zero coster that reduced the runner's hand size by 1. There were certain trap decks that played this that wanted to get a flatline, and this made it a bit easier to flatline people, but this was a notable current on the fact that it was 0 cost and 0 influence. So just the fact that certain decks needed ways to turn off runner currents or their game plan could lose, this did just show up in certain decks to be able to turn off runner currents. And that kind of shows you the parts of the current system that were not very fun, if you ask me, is that you had to play the pseudo blank card in your deck just so you don't lose to something else that's hard to interact with. I don't actually know that this deck, which came in second at Worlds, needed the Enforced Curfew for any other reason besides turning off a single runner current that will pull up. Maybe it did have reasons. This card is also notable because while I have an entire Netrunner collection, this is one card that I lent one copy out to someone and I don't think I got it back. So I'm missing one copy of Enforced Curfew. Please don't unban this so I never have to worry about it. All right, this isn't a current, but this also falls into a kind of a box of cards that were all banned simultaneously, which were Snap, Res, Ice. That's the term that's used often. This is Engram Flush. It's a Nisei card. Again, another banned Nisei card. There's a couple of these. And it was a 2 cost to get a 5 strength 2 subroutine code gate. And this code gate is really quite good. The issue with this card, it's too cheap. It's too good on every single board state, and it's only 1 influence. So this card was showing up everywhere. If you play Startup, you probably know what I'm talking about already. This card does show up everywhere because it's very good. It's not banned in Startup. Startup doesn't have any bans. This was addressed in the ban list update of, when was this? June of 2021. There were certain cards that they referred to as Snap Res. These are ice that should be resed very cheaply without much consideration on every single board state. Their low cost, high strength, and impactful subroutines made them an easy decision to res in all circumstances. This means their presence has a dampening effect on runner aggression throughout the meta. Their low cost punishing face check made trying to pressure the corpse defenses to force reses less rewarding. I always say when I'm teaching Netrunner that one of the best things you can do is be aggressive early. Force the corp to res their ice, spend their money, be economically destabilized, and you have information of what you're running into. But the problem with Engram Flush is you didn't do a lot of financial damage, and this did more damage back to the runner. A lot of times it was wrong to face check as a criminal, the face check type faction, because if an Engram Flush hits some of your programs, they're gone and that's it. And that was the problem with Engram Flush. It was just way too good. On influence, on low cost, on massive strength, on really good subroutines. So Engram Flush unfortunately got banned because it also had a ubiquity problem. This was showing up as a 3 of everywhere. The banning of Engram Flush actually really hurt as this was the mid-range to low-cost code gate that showed up as a 3 of in every Jinteki list, and Jinteki Ice Suites have fallen a fair bit since then, so this is one of the cards that just got banned. Very similarly, this is Slot Machine. This is Jess Horrig's championship designed card. I love the design of this card. It's fun, it's flavorful, but very similarly, it's 1 influence, it's 5 strength, it has 3 subroutines, and a very impactful on-encounter text. I'm not going to run through the text of this because we could talk about this for a while, but this card was fun. It was really, really fun and actually did sometimes help the runner more than the corp. But on its own, it was hard to break. You would res it on every board state and it was showing up a 3 of in most decks. So it ended up to get banned. So hopefully we see more ice and hopefully runner aggression is a bit more impactful. Next up, Friends in High Places, one of my least favorite Netrunner cards of all times. For 2 costs, you could play this HB operation. It's 1 influence. It showed up everywhere. And you basically could take 2 cards from archives and install them, paying all install costs. And paying all install costs makes you think, oh, well, that means I have to pay 2 or 3 credits to put this ice back up on a server. But 95% of the time, this card was played just to reinstall 2 assets, which the runner spent a lot of money trashing last turn. It's important to understand the Mumbet cycle in Netrunner was actually kind of a bad time for Netrunner. A lot of people stopped playing Netrunner because the Mumbet cycle was the rise of asset-based decks. The Mumbet cycle had a lot of really, really strong assets that recently rotated in standard card pool, and we're feeling the impact of that. But there were so many corp decks that at the time were playing 20 to 22 assets and forced them on the table, and the game became less about multi-access breaking ice and more about keeping your finances up and trashing the right stuff. Now this deck did come out later, but this is the sort of idea, 23 assets. A lot of people didn't like this and stopped playing Netrunner at the time, and a year later at the next cycle, we got Friends in High Places. And so the issue here is, did you just spend 8 credits trying to trash the most key cards in this deck? For 2 credits, the corporation is going to put them back on the table. And that was the issue. Just about every deck ran some amount of these. It was only 1 influence. It was basically good in just about any list. Getting that recursion for 2 cost is just great. But it was the most worst felt in these sort of asset lists. Oh my God, Industrial Genomics never got banned somehow. But this increased the trash cost of all cards because of archive stuff, and they ran 25 assets, and some of these assets tried to kill you. They cost 8 to trash, and then you brought 2 of them back. I've seen regionals where the winning play was playing Friends in High Places. That's it. Didn't like this. A lot of people didn't like it, and now it's gone. And recursion has become a lot more, since then, recursion as a whole has become a lot more measured. You're seeing a lot more recursion cards remove themselves from the game or be able to only res a single card and then remove other copies from the heap. There's a lot of ways that recursion has become a lot more balanced in Netrunner, but yeah, this was the worst version of it. Hey, Future Andre here, and while I recorded this video just last week, we were expecting a new updated ban list going into Worlds 2022. And lo and behold, Friday morning, just a couple hours ago, we got the new ban list 2209. So I'm going to take some time to put some inserts from Future Andre into this video just to make this a complete video that will explain the entire ban list going into Worlds 2022 and maybe a bit on in the future. It's a pretty minimal update, obviously a very important update, but it's only 5 cards. And let's start here at the top. I think we just talked about how it's important to make sure that recursion on the corporation side is very measured. And we actually saw 2 recursion cards just recently banned in the new update. Firstly, this is Archived Memories. This is an HB card that costs 0. It's only 2 influence, so you can play this just about anywhere, and allows you to simply add a card from Archives to HQ. This is actually a really old card. It came from the original core set back in 2012, and it's still around, and it's always been marginally playable in certain archetypes and certain decks. I think you saw it in a couple decks already we've looked at today. But this was largely banned in response to a powerful deck that arose recently in the Continental season. This is the Bridgman Sokka list, the Drago Reality Plus list that won the APAC Continentals and nearly won, had some really good performances in the Continentals following that. To give you a quick recap of what this deck does, it's playing the new Midnight Sun asset, Drago Ivanov. It's putting this remote server and advancing it every turn, and then spending those 2 hosted advancement counters at instant speed to give the runner a tag. Then they spend their last click that turn, and mind you, the tag is relatively cheap to do. It only takes time, not money, because they're getting their money back with Reality Plus. They play one of their tag punishment cards they have in the deck. And the deck has a bunch, but I think the 2 most important ones are generally Market Forces, which is at a minimum a 6 credit swing, even more if the runner stops clearing the tags and decides to just pile them on. It just pushes them out of the game. And Self-Growth Program, which returns the runner's cards back to their hand. So they no longer have breakers, let alone the economy cards they need to fight this economic war. And this deck was powerful, but a lot of people thought it was pretty miserable to play against, sometimes to play as, but also to watch if you're a spectator, because it did the same thing every single turn, advance, tag, and then waited for the runner to clear the tag, and they just traded, and it was a very awkward thing to watch sometimes. But the big inclusion in this deck is 3 copies of Archived Memories, and this card was very powerful. Not only did it let you get that Drago back, it did have 3, but if the runner spent a lot of time and went kind of deep into the remote server to trash the Drago, the corporation just very trivially played an Archived Memories and put it back on the table. Let alone, Archived Memories was such a powerful card because it allowed the corporation to return and replay their tag punishment over and over and over again. So it wasn't that you just had to duck the first Market Forces, you had to duck all the Market Forces. During Continental season, we saw a poor runner take 7 Market Forces throughout the whole game and lose an immense amount of economy. And that is the power of cards like Archived Memories, is that if you have anything that is a bit overperforming, it can force these prisons. It forces you to re-encounter, to re-interact with these powerful cards that you're hoping to see once, but now you're seeing over and over and over again. It really kind of dampens the effectiveness of trashing some of the key assets when, again, they can't just come back. And so this deck was addressed, which I think people are very excited for. I do think some of the runner cards that are the best against this archetype have also been banned, and we'll get to that in a bit later on in the video. The idea is that this list was addressed not by the Drago ban, not by banning the tag punishment, by banning the recursion. So while this list probably still has teeth, the amount of windows it has, the sort of like timing of when this can hit you and when it can't hit you is going to be a bit more nuanced, and there should be some more gaps where maybe the runner can breathe. Speaking of grinding the runner down, I guess to some extent, this is Preemptive Action, a 0-cost neutral terminal operation. So when you play this, it ends your turn. You generally play a last click for that reason. Allows you to take 3 cards from archives and just shuffle them back in. This was actually a widely playable card for a while, largely in a world before Spin Doctor. This card, Preemptive Action, showed up as a 1 of, sometimes a 2 of, in just about every corp list, because every corp list wanted a bit of recursion in their list just to get some important stuff back in, usually upgrades that were trash, some of the assets. But also it gave them a way to deal with some assets, or some agendas that were trashed off the top of the deck by imps or stargates or stuff like that. Recursion's important. In a world without Stargate, we're actually seeing way less of this. You're sometimes seeing it as only a 1 of in certain lists. This is Bridgman's Intercontinental's winning op list, and it did run a single copy of Preemptive Action. I do think some of the more modern versions are actually cutting this for other options, but the idea is that this card is just played to get some of those assets back in R&D, just to bulk R&D up, and specifically in op gives you some more things you can find with your ability. And preemptive action was banned kind of preemptively. We're not seeing it be a problematic card, but it's the sort of card that can take that archive memory space. The idea is that, oh, did you survive my 3 tag punishment cards? I'm just going to put them back in for the future. We did actually see lists like that. You are seeing lists earlier in the video of decks that were running archive memories and preemptive action just to recur things like their snare or their neural EMP, just to make sure that the game goes longer, the deck doesn't run out, and there's less agenda density in R&D. I think Nisei spells it out pretty clearly in their ban list update, where they talk about banning preemptive action and archive memories to limit corp recursion and force them into more proactive game plans to create more dynamic and interesting games. And I'm obviously a big fan of that. I like that. The idea is that if you trash a card, it's most likely to stay trashed for a while. If you survive an operation, it's most likely you're not going to see that again, let alone immediately. So now there's just less ways for decks to just like rebuild themselves and grind the runner down for the future. Of course, 100% has to be mentioned that Spin Doctor is incredibly common. It's a 3 of in just about every corporation deck. And while this does give you that card draw and does give you the recursion, my favorite thing about Spin Doctor is that it forces card draw. So if you're using Spin Doctor for recursion, the corporation has to draw 2 cards, which inherently just does accelerate the game. So you can't just sit there and say, I'm going to put things back into R&D. You have to also draw at the same time, which means hopefully the agendas are coming out. It means that the game is actually pushed forward on the timer inherently of technically the corp running out of cards. And those are the 2 cards that changed on the ban list on the corporation side. We'll be back in a bit to talk about the runner stuff, but just some recursion cards. I'm actually pretty excited to see what this list does going forward. Back to past Andre. This is Game Changer, another HB card though. This has a trash cost on it and it also removes itself from the game instead of trashing, so you know you're dealing with something impactful. And for 6 credits, you could gain a click for every agenda in the runner score area. So you wouldn't see this often in most the regular HB decks you're expecting, the precision designs, the ASAs, but you would only see this in sports metal decks. The sort of decks that would run a lot of small agendas just to make sure the sports metal ability is firing very consistently. So if you have a deck with like 14 small agendas, it was very common to see a Game Changer played to gain the corporation 5 clicks. And it doesn't matter if that's inherently very expensive, because if you won the game, well, the game is over. So look at this. This is the world's winning deck that Limes played. You have 14 agendas. The majority of them are 1-pointers, and you ran 3 Game Changer. And a lot of times you would play this Game Changer to be able to score out your last 3-point agendas and suddenly win. And it's hard for the runner to interact with that. Sure, they could go ahead and try and trash the Game Changer, but that's also why this list ran 3 copies of Archive Memories to bring them back. And this won Worlds. You also saw this in other archetypes. This came first at German Nationals the year before. Same sort of idea, a few less agendas, but this deck actually using a combo could score out multiple agenda points on the table in a turn, using things like Arella Salvatore and calibration testing. It's a bit of a combo, but again, a lot of people were frustrated dealing with this, and so it got banned for being very, very powerful. Funny enough, back at the time, runners were actually going out of their way to play these sort of cards that had forfeit an agenda as a cost, just to get agendas out of their score area to make sure that the Game Changer couldn't win. Artist Colony was still pretty good card regardless of the meta, but Data Dealer was showing up unironically in criminal decks to be able to deal with Game Changer. That's how much of an impact it had on the meta. These were some of the best decks at the time. It's now banned. And speaking about HB nonsense, this is Project Vacheron, a 5/3 agenda, which is worth 0 agenda points if stolen from anywhere else besides archives, unless you wait, 3 or 4 turns for this to tick down. This card is very powerful. It is still legal in startup, and if you're not playing this in HB in startup, I don't know what you're doing. But this got banned at the response of this. You're gonna see Whiteblade's name come up a heck of a lot in this video. This is a nice little image where I think he's comparing himself to Jesus. But this was a bit of an abrasive post. There's a lot of conversation based off of this, but the idea here is very sound. It's another sports metal deck that can go blazingly fast. Mind you, Game Changer was banned here, but this deck ran all the fast events they could get access to, and so it was very hard for runners to interact with this. And the thing with Vacheron is if the runner steals a Vacheron on turn 3, it's blank, because you're planning to win the game on turn 6. So this was as if this deck had 6 fewer agenda points that the runner could steal, and they still have to find 7. That was the call out here with Vacheron, is that Vacheron is a bit nonsense in a game where the games are inherently going too quickly for this to have text that is relevant. A lot of the good runner decks at this time were able to like Stargate and trash Vacherons into archives just so that they didn't have text. But yeah, that was an issue. This card frustrates the heck out of me also in startup, where you steal these and it doesn't matter. If you don't get them on turn 1 or turn 2, the game's probably over before they matter at all. So Vacheron has showed up in so many of these HB lists and is currently banned in the standard format. I'm a big fan. Speaking again of Whiteblade, this is high profile target, one of the recent bans just last month. This was one of the premier meat damage tag cards in the format. For 5 influence, you can do 2 meat damage for every tag the runner has. So if they're floating a lot of tags, it's a one-stop shop solution to flatline. But this card got banned in response to another card. This, mind you, is Whiteblade himself on the art. He won the APAC championship back in 2020, and this card was designed. And this card allows you to spend your whole turn to trash a bunch of rezzed cards to give the runner an equal amount of tags. And for this card to exist, which is a very interesting, a fascinating card, unfortunately, I think competitively doesn't have a home yet because Wayland horizontal decks aren't too strong. And there's a lot of ways to deal with meat damage right now. This card could not exist in the same card pool at high profile target, because all you'd have to do is play a card like Biotic Labor, and a card that gives you an extra click on the turn. So you can play Mutually Assured Destruction, give the runner 4 tags or whatever you need, and then high profile target them. So as we got this card, which is a more interesting win condition for some of the acid-based decks or late game into Wayland that has a lot of res stuff, as a response, high profile target had to go. This is actually pretty meaningful because this card was one of the few cards that kept in check the archetype of tag me runners. We'll get to this because there's a fair few tag me runner cards that are banned in the other part of this video. But this is one of the few things that kept floating a lot of tags being a real threat. So we'll see if tag me runners see a bit more play. Next up, Gold Farmer, another pretty kind of surprising little NBN barrier ice. It has 2 end the runs unless you want to pay through them for 6 credits. But it has this text that says when the runner breaks a printed subroutine on this, they lose a credit. This was a card that was deemed to be a bit too efficient and too good for its cost. I wouldn't exactly call it one of the snap res ice, but it's kind of similar to that. But there was no runner that was getting through this 3-cost ice for less than 4 credits. You're generally paying 3 to 4 credits to get through this. And on top of that, this was seeing the most play in GameNet, which it was released alongside. And the problem is a lot of runners were going through this with the GameNet, losing credits on the break. And so this became a 6-credit swing. The corp gained 2 credits, the runner lost 4 credits, and that's a lot for an ice that only cost 3 to res. It was overperforming for what it cost and the slot it's in. On top of that, people were excited to play this out of faction. It was actually starting to show up everywhere. So it got banned pretty fast before it hit its like mass terminal velocity of showing up everywhere. But yeah, it's just a bit of an overperforming little piece of yellow ice. Still very legal in the startup format, and a reason why my Anarch deck always plays Chisel, because I don't want to break this ever. These are fun. There's 2 of these. This is Hired Help and Watch the World Burn. These were some of the Magnum Opus cards. There's a very confusing set here on Netrunner called Magnum Opus that holds about 7 cards. And these are cards that were released at the Magnum Opus. Magnum Opus was the final Fantasy Flight Games World Championship in 2018 in Minnesota at the Game Center at the time. And here, this was a big celebration of Netrunner because Fantasy Flight Games lost the license. This was the last Worlds. And they released a couple old cards that had champion design cards that weren't released yet, that were planned for the future. But they also did this Mad Libs type experiment. I was there. I participated in this. Between rounds, on a giant projector, they would show 2 options for a card. And between rounds, you would vote on which option you wanted to pursue. And then the text on this got longer and longer. And we kept choosing different options. And at the end, we ended up with 1 runner card and 1 corp card that both cost a single influence, but were neutral. Hired Help and Watch the World Burn. Without even discussing the text on these cards, and the text on these cards are a bit ridiculous, these cards were banned in the standard format because inherently they were never play tested, not even once. These were cards that were printed and distributed to players at Worlds just after they were built. Literally no one had played a game with these before they were handed out to people. So for that reason, they were just straight up banned. I don't even know, like, even if these were part of a data pack, would they get banned or not if they were like a regular release? I'm not sure. This card is kind of weird on its own because it says there's additional cost to run the server. The runner must trash one agenda. That's not a term that shows up on any other card, if I'm not mistaken. It usually says forfeit an agenda. So technically there's now rules that address this. When you trash an agenda, it goes from your score area to the archives so you can go get it. But a big issue that people had with this card, it prevents you from running a server unless you've run HQ this turn. But this upgrade you can install on HQ, which means that if this is on HQ, barring any sort of tricks to deal with this, the runner could not run HQ at all until they forfeit an agenda. Trash an agenda. You see what I did there? And that is not fun, probably strong. I don't know. The other side was Watch the World Burn, which was a terminal run event, which that actually is kind of an interesting concept. But it also forced you to remember stuff throughout the history of an entire game, which is new to Netrunner, and allowed you to remove from games certain cards you access. This was a cool card, technically, because it allowed you to trash and deal with assets really cheaply over the long term. But again, I've never seen any of these cards in a real game, I don't think, because again, they weren't tested, so they just got banned on the spot. Kill Switch. It's a current, so it's banned. It's a very niche current. It's actually a very strong current if you're playing specifically the brain/core damage archetype. It was brain damage back then. And it was one of the few cards that could leverage money into core damage. Core damage is hard to deal out, and this actually was one of the more powerful core damage cards. Not that anybody played it, but I did sometimes. This is Mass Commercialization, a zero-cost transaction that gave you 2 credits for each ice with an advancement on it. I really don't like this card, and I'm very happy it got banned. This is one of those sort of cards that works for that archetype that I've said before I don't like, in which corporations just sit back, they advance everything, they don't really do anything meaningful, and eventually get to a late game board state in which it's very expensive to break everything. But the weird thing about this card is one of the few economy cards in the game that's impossible to interact with. Inherently, most economy cards on the corp side cost money to play, or they're assets that you have to protect, so runners can pressure economy, force the corporation to res, to spend money, to take their money, to trash their assets, to enforce them so they're not able to play the economy cards. But the frustrating thing about mass commercialization is that it was really easy to just advance everything slowly, and then even if you dip down to 0 credits, you play this suddenly getting 14. And runners can't do anything against that besides specifically start trashing ice, which is an Anarch only thing. But this really drew the ire and got banned, and a very quick response to a single deck archetype. This is Mendax's deck called War of the Worlds. And how this deck worked, there's a couple banned cards in here, is that it would do the thing that we said. It would strap all this big ice on every server and advance them slowly, one at a time. This specifically was a bit more economically viable with the new Built to Last identity that came out in System Gateway. And once their money was good, they would play a single copy of Biotic Labor, so they had an extra click. They would install a government takeover, which, while this card isn't in the standard format, also got banned in response to this deck archetype, and then just played a Red Planet Couriers, one of my least favorite cards in Netrunner, to move all the advancement counters over to a single card and score out that 6 points and hopefully win by that time. That's all the deck did. It was really frustrating to play against because it was very slow. It only ran 7 agendas, so if you didn't end up stealing the one of Government Takeover, you had to steal most of the agendas in the list to win. It ran really big ice and didn't build a remote server ever, and just kind of like very similarly in some ways to that really boring potatoes Jinteki deck, just iced up everything, did install advance, advance, advance credit, credit, advance credit, credit. And mass commercialization was a really strong part of the win package of this because you could not keep their money down. You could not at all. And it also had punitive counterstrike, which I forgot about. So even if you stepped out of line, suddenly they gained 14, punitive. This was competitive, and it was a competitive deck. I think this is a more optimized version from Pincel that was winning tournaments just after that. There's some small changes to this, but this deck was really not fun to play against. It was really slow. It was really dirtly. It could be beat, but I think the decks that were beating it were very specific Anarch Apocalypse type decks that could trash all ice at once. And people didn't love this. It was not fun to watch on top tables. It wasn't fun to play against. And it was one of the few decks that I think was banned very quickly. This was around for about a month and a half before the ban list banned Government Takeover and Mass Commercialization, just so that nobody would have to play against this archetype. Some people decried that, said you should leave it for a while to see if the meta can address to it. But this is one of the quicker bans in the history of Netrunner. Media Blitz. Love the art of this. It's on a playmat from the national season, and it's a current, so it's banned inherently. The text on this card was fun though. You could choose an agenda in the runner score area and gain that text. You don't gain when scored text, but you would get ongoing abilities. So this is like the easiest way to get a Jumon actually to do something without having to score it, which is always good fun. Next up, we have Mati Makundo, one of the few identities. I think this is the only corporation identity that is currently banned, and it had a ridiculously powerful ability. I'm just going to read it. It says, whenever the runner approaches a server, you can install a piece of ice from HQ in the innermost position, protecting that server, ignoring all costs. When the runner approaches the server, a lot of people got this wrong. It doesn't mean when they're starting a run, but it means right before they're about to breach the server and see what's in that server. So once they got through all of your ice, or even if you had no ice, you could say, hold on, see which ice is in your hand that is the best for the board state, and just slam it down on the table. So if the runner was running as soon as turn 1 to deal with the Rashida Yahim or whatever asset they need to deal with, you can feed them the scariest sentry, the scariest code gate, the barrier they don't have an answer to, and that is incredibly powerful. You can only use this once per turn, so it's a bit more fun to play around. But on top of that, this is actually one of the few corporation identities or abilities that actually scale really well into the late game. In the late game, when you're installing a card onto your remote server, and instead of paying like 3 credits, 4 credits to get that 4th or 5th ice or whatever the numbers work out to, you were getting it for free. And that actually gives you more value over time throughout the game. This ability was just massively powerful. And this did well. It did get some top finishes at Worlds in 2018, which it was legal. After that, I think this archetype got even more strong with the introduction of border control. A barrier that allows you to end the run at instant speed worked really good with Mati Makundo. But Motiba Kundo also had a lot of flexible ways to build the deck. You saw these asset-based decks that were running 23 assets and spamming out things on the table that could win the game, but it was hard for the runner to interact with these early. Because if you were not ready to deal with any ice, you could immediately find a Cortex lock protecting some asset out of nowhere, and this could flatline you. So it was a very flexible identity, but it was a massively powerful identity. This was the only basically Jinteki Glacier-esque ability you'd see at the time, and that was probably too strong. There was a lot of like tier 2, tier 3 runners that just had no game against this because they were not able to deal with the biggest ice that soon on in the game, so they just could not interact at all. And this was like the big disparity between competitive Netrunner and casual Netrunner, and if you just got into the wrong Jinteki.net lobby, you're going to have no fun. If you ask me, I had some of my favorite Netrunner games playing runner against Motiba Kundo as long as you were prepared to deal with it and you were playing something of equal power. The ability is nuanced, it's interesting. You have to like try and bait it out so they could use their ability sooner on into the turn before you're doing something really important. But it was kind of fun and cool. I'd love an ability like this to come back, but I do recognize that this was way stronger than anything else. And not that it won worlds, but it was a massively powerful but creatively flexible ability. Kind of like this. Next up, we have Rolling Brownout. This is an NBN current. I've never seen it hit the table. The text on it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's kind of expensive too, and you didn't have to play it. And again, I've been saying this the whole time. There were so many kind of niche, interesting currents, but they didn't see any play on the corp side because you could play this. And this is the preeminent answer or lose current in the game. For one cost, fully neutral, you could play this current. It would stay around until the runner played their own current, which they had to, or steal an agenda, which they have no control over. And it says the install cost of each resource is increased by 2. That Xbox, that single line is so massively strong. There are so many runners that have the majority of their economy attached to resources, and they just cannot afford to pay 5 credits for a daily cast on turn 1. Because if they're doing that, they're not doing anything else. It takes longer for that card to pay off, if at all, and it's a bit of a nightmare. This card also just says every. I wish this card said the first time so that runners could like plan it out and install multiple resources on a single turn to get around this. But that was the problem with this current. This showed up as a 3 of in just about every single corporation deck. And it, in some instances, if you were not playing currents, which each faction did not have powerful currents, there was a non-game on the table. There were some games that just nobody was making good decisions because your economy engine did not exist. And unfortunately, one of the biggest examples of this was at World Championship. This was a 2017. This is Jess's deck, and this is a cerebral imaging deck, a very interesting ability. And you see that it's running a single copy of Scarcity Resources. And this was played on turn 1 against Crit HD. This is Greg Tung, the former lead designer at Nisei. And you'll notice that this deck is running a fair bit of resources, and not any resources, but the sort of Shaper Econ engine package resources that are very expensive that you need to get down early because they fuel your entire deck. Professional Contacts for 7 credits is too much. Aesop's Pawn Shop needs to come down. You need to install more cards, but when this costs 3 credits, like it's still really hard to set up. This deck is only running 3 Sure Gamble. All the economy in this deck is attached to the resource engine. And so you see this. This is the World Championships in 2017. This is turn 1. And Jess on the right, she plays a hedge fund, ices up R&D, and plays the Scarcity Resources, the 1 of in the deck. And it's on the table for the whole game. And this game's not very close. Like you see, Greg does his best, tries to get some agendas off the top, is not playing currents inherently. Shaper did not have access to any competitive currents, and that basically decides the whole game. The current, mind you, is still here at the top. And that was the finals, and it was no fun to watch. 1 of in the deck had such a big impact on the game, and this was the big definition of the answer or lose currents. And this card was everywhere. It's not just a 1 of in the list. The cerebral imaging as a 1 of is actually rare, but every single deck at the time was largely running 3 of these. And so it became this like competition of every other deck having to run currents. And like I said, not every current was equally powerful. Like Anarchs had good things. Criminals really didn't. Shapers, no, not at all. So didn't like it. One of the most frustrating cards. And I think if any current had to be banned, I would want to ban this one and a runner current that we'll get to in a bit. But yeah, this was the highlight, the highest high of where the current have an answer or lose was very popular. This card is way too strong. Now on the other side, again, there are some other corp currents, but they never saw play because why play these when you can play Scarcity? This makes each run, first run, cost an additional credit. Cool. Didn't ever see play. On top of that, Surveillance Sweep, another interesting NBN current, has a cool ability. It makes the runner trace first on a trace. That's kind of cool. So they have to overspend if they're scared of a trace, and then you spend nothing. Cool ability. Showed up in some niche decks. Violet level clearance. This is a clearance. There are still some clearance in Netrunner. Historically, there's a lot of clearances. We've seen blue, green, ultraviolet, violet, black, I think. And they were all very good. A lot of them drew cards and gained credits all at the same time. And Violet level clearance was showing up very consistently back in the day when System Gateway came out. Precision design was a very strong identity out of the gate. It still is today. And the additional 6 hand size means that drawing a mass amount of cards even at the end of your turn isn't so bad. And with this costing 5 credits, it was very easy for the deck to install a card, Violet level clearance to draw 3 cards or 4 cards, and gain 3 credits. And at that time, precision design was the most competitive identity, and so Violet level clearance was banned as a response, just to bring the power level of that deck down. This is a trashable card, but like the fact that it's playable on turn 1 on most board states, it's quite good. Drawing last click can be a bit dodgy, but 6 hand size definitely helps. Next up, we have Whampoa Reclamation. This is a neutral asset. It's a corporation. It does cost 2 influence, so I think the designers understood this was a powerful card. But at instant speed once per turn, it allows you to trash a card from HQ, to take any card from archives, oftentimes it was the card you trashed, to put it on the bottom of R&D. You can only use this, again, once per turn. I really never liked abilities like this. Taking agendas and putting them on the bottom of your deck means that if there's no shuffle ability, if the corporation never shuffles their own deck, that agenda is as good as out of the game. At the time that this was playable, there were frighteningly few ways for the runner to either shuffle R&D on their own terms or to be able to access the bottom of R&D. So a lot of times this showed up in some of the corporation decks that weren't interested at all at scoring agendas. And we've seen this show up in some of the other decks we've already highlighted. The sort of like Jinteki net damage decks that were just grinding people out, they would bottom their agendas. This is like a Wayland asset spam deck, same sort of idea, that this would take their agendas and put them on the bottom of the deck because they have no interest in scoring these out. They want to grind the game through all these assets, and that's their win condition. So as long as nobody shuffles, not only is this an okay recursion card, it just takes agendas out of the game. And that makes the weakness of these sort of decks, where the way that you can win is stealing agendas and closing the game quickly, hopefully have no weakness whatsoever. Yeah, I didn't like this. And since then, there's been a lot of attention to make sure these sort of prison decks have some sort of inherent weaknesses besides, keeping all the assets down and getting economy over time. That kind of works. But these sort of abilities to bottom cards, there's way fewer of them in the standard format. Disposal HQ was not a popular card, but I know I saw this fire in like turn 1 and take a Jinteki deck, put 6 points underneath their deck, and then you're trying to win when you have to steal 7 of the 14 agendas left in the game, and you're already having to deal with all the net damage. I never liked this stuff, and luckily Whampoa got banned. And that is all the corp bans. You see the currents, there's a big conversation about those. You see some mean assets, some overtuned ice, and some win condition packages that were too hard to interact with. I think the majority of bans are on the corp side. I don't know what that says. I think people are a lot more critical against corporation win cons that seem a bit out of line because it's hard to interact with them as opposed to the runner stuff, which requires a bit more interaction, but it is what it is. And we have a couple more runner cards to go through. Let's start here at the top, 419. This is the criminal identity from the Katara cycle, a really fun, flavorful identity here with the Moral Scammer. And 419 basically forced the corporation to pay a credit on the first install at turn, otherwise the card would be exposed. And information is definitely important in Netrunner, but that exposed got additional value, specifically with the very popular Amakua, that for each time a card got exposed, the Amakua got a charge counter, or a virus counter, and that virus counter made this a better and better breaker. It can't inherently boost its own strength. So a lot of times corporations were forced to pay that credit. And so now you had a criminal that had inherent built-in credit denial throughout the whole game with minimal effort. And 419 was very, very popular. Feature Andre here. Psych. 419 has actually just been unbanned. And while after this, I will explain, past Andre will explain why 419 was banned. Specifically, it was crowding out all the other criminal identities and was overperforming for the period of time before Worlds. It was just banned a year ago before Worlds, basically a year ago to date. 419 has now been unbanned. And if you see right now, criminal did need some help. So Nisei has got a powerful criminal identity back into the mix. And if you look at some of the results of the last couple month of Continental season, you're seeing that criminal is really underperforming. This is the Intercontinental Championship. While this was an invitation only event, there's only 12 players. There's literally no criminal to be seen. If you look at Euro Africas, again, we're only at a 15% criminal representation in the entire 100-person field. If you look at the top cut, of course, there's no criminals whatsoever. And if you go back even a week before that at the American Continentals, we're looking at about 17% criminal. And even then, of course, there's nothing in the top cut. Now, I think this is a bit more of a nuanced problem. It's not so much that criminals aren't good, but more so, and as if you see here, a lot of the shaper is very powerful, maybe even overperforming. So there was not a good reason to do something else. I do think Nisei wanted to go out of the way to produce a criminal, to give people some excitement, to give people a reason and a powerful card that they can play with, so they might reconsider playing criminal. Again, I do think the landscape of the Shaper meta should change a bit with the other bans going forward. And as I'm going to say in just a bit, in the past, 419 was banned because 419 was the criminal you'd see everywhere at the cost of seeing all the other criminal identities. There was no reason to play Xayah back in the day because you could play 419, and that generally was considered to be more powerful. And modernly, Nisei has kind of gone back to that. They said that now that the card pool there's more criminal identities that are a bit more different, and the card pool is maybe a bit wider, maybe a bit more interesting, that they are confident that we're going to see more criminals than just 419 all the time. They talked about how if you might see Sable, if you're seeing Deep Dive Criminal, a very specific archetype of an aggressive multi-axis criminal. You have Xayah, who specifically is the best criminal if you want to play the Tag Me archetype, something we'll address later in this video. And you have Steve Cambridge if you want to see targeted HQ pressure and get a bit of recursion, and maybe you find your bread to be a bit too spicy. So you're going to see all of these, but I do think you're going to see still a fair bit of 419. I think 419 modernly has some good legs, specifically if we're seeing more like that op deck. Actually, the interaction between 419 and op is not very favorable to 419, but the idea is that this is still a very good identity. The link on its own is very good. This is just still, to me, the fallback good stuff criminal if that is something you just want to play. So you're going to see, very likely, 419 do something cool at Worlds. Back to past Andre. 419 was actually banned relatively recently, about almost a year ago to this point, preparing for Worlds 2021. 419 was overperforming. Some of the top runners at the time were Reg 419, so just regular good stuff 419 and Hive Mind Max, stuff like that. So if you look at the standings, you see 419 was very popular back then. This is the Off the Grid Midwest Championship from last summer, and you see the top cut, it's almost entirely 419 and Max, and you saw that same idea throughout everything. What is this? This is the Nationals, the American Continental Championships. 419 takes it. You see some other criminals, a lot of Anarch, and I think it's the same for Euro and Africa Continental Championships. 419 is taking that one as well. It was a pretty robust deck. It was flexible. It had the economic denial. It had everything you wanted to. This is a version of the list. And just, it was the preeminent criminal. And so this was banned as a response to try and see other criminals see a bit more play, because 419 was a bit too simple. It was almost always the criminal you'd be running into. I know when I was playing casual corp decks on Jinteki.net, 419 was really frustrating, because if your corporation deck didn't have a very robust economy, you were not able to keep that economy pressure from the 419 exposed, and you found yourself not playing the game of Netrunner as much as clicking for credits. The ban was hoping that we'll see more Steve Cambridge and Xayah, and you did. In fact, Steve Cambridge became a very popular criminal since 419 left. And another card that was banned a fair bit sooner than 419 was the current Corporate Grant. And this card was monstrous. As long as you were installing one card a turn, the first time a turn you install something, the corporation loses another credit. So with 419, you're paying a credit a turn. With the Corporate Grant, you're losing a credit a turn. And you see where if your corporation deck did not have a very strong economy, it was hard to keep up with that 2 credit tax every single turn, regardless what you're doing. If you're clicking for 3 credits every turn, you're basically only getting 1 credit back. Worth noting, at the same time that 419 was banned, Nisei did unban Pad Tap, a card right now that currently could be considered banned in the upcoming patch, but this was a way to give back criminal strength and a bit of that economic denial. Future Andre again, we were totally right about this one. Pad Tap has just got banned. And while we mentioned that Pad Tap was unbanned as a response to 419 getting banned, that has entirely reversed. But if you ask me, even if 419 wasn't unbanned recently at the 2209 update, I do think Pad Tap would have still hit the ban block. And Pad Tap represents what is called an economy over time card in Netrunner, and this has been a really large conversation, specifically if you've been watching Continentals over the last month or so. Pad Tap is very simple. It comes down for 1 influence and 0 cost, very easy to play, and it gives you a credit. The first time a turn, a corp card gives the corporation a credit. And mind you, corp decks are definitely playing cards in them that give them credits, let alone consistently over time, specifically assets. There's a lot of assets that give you credits at the start of every turn. So Pad Tap is it's not very conditional. It's almost always going to give you some amount of money, let alone it's not hard to get value from this when it costs 0. Now the corp can trash this. It does cost 3 credits and a click, so it is a big cost to pull this thing down. But this card is so easily playable that you are basically seeing it everywhere. If on Netrunner DB you search a Pad Tap, you see the list is huge. It's not just criminals. As a 1 influence 0 cost card, it's showing up absolutely everywhere. And that was, again, another big hit to Pad Tap. Another card that might be a bit ubiquitous, and it makes a lot of decks feel very similar. But I think the big conversation here came to a head in response to this Control Lat deck. This is the Sokka Drip Economy Shaper deck that has taken the Continental season by storm, basically won multiple Continentals in the season to some extent. But this deck runs what I would call the lowest effort economy package you could play currently in Netrunner, and it's still overbearingly powerful. The idea is that this deck ran 3 copies of Pat Tap. You got them down early, you're getting credits over time, and mind you can also get these credits on your turn based off of certain interactions, but that was just a lot of money on a very cheap card. And then you're playing other of these, again, clickless economy cards. This deck is on 2 Tapworm, which recently got more powerful, as we mentioned, with the virus suite, the Cyberdeck Sandbox getting banned out. So this card also gives you a clickless economy over time. And then lastly, our final banned runner card in 2209, Rizeki. This is a 3 of in the list. This card has also been a very similar fate here, with it's a very easy to play card with only 1 influence taking up 1 MU. This card comes down early and gets you a massive amount of money. And the problem with all these sort of cards together is when they hit the table, the corporation knows that the later the game goes, the amount of value that these cards gets immense and more immense over time, so corporations generally have to go quickly. If a Rizeki comes down on turn 1 and the game is 12 turns, that means the Rizeki got clicklessly 10 credits, right? It might be 9 credits, just about 10 credits. The longer the game goes, that value can get ridiculous. If the game goes really long to 20 turns, that's nearly a 20 credit card for a single click. And there's nothing on the corporation side that can compete with that. So the idea is that a lot of corporation decks had to go faster to ensure that these decks, that the Rizeki Pat Tap decks, are not getting enough value, that the Rizekis actually are awkward. And that had a huge impact on the meta going forward, in which corporation decks, the only ones that are really succeeding modernly are the ones that have a very fast game plan. And that's, again, accentuates some of the other issues of some of the other cards here. It's really hard to purge a Tapworm when you also understand you have to be quick into meta, because you can't take a turn as a corporation just to pull this thing down. Same idea with the Pat Tap. While you can trash these, you know there's going to be 2 more, and spending a click and 3 credits is a lot of money when you need to be inherently fast in the face of all this other clickless economy. So for this reason, Pat Tap has got banned. Again, Rizeki has got banned as well, and I'm very excited about this. I think this is the card that most people were excited to see banned after seeing all these Shaper decks just slam down all these cards and not really have to worry about economy in a meaningful way. But again, it's a card that you saw just about everywhere, not just Shapers. Everybody could play this for 1 influence. I think there's another interesting conversation here that people were really interested to see whether Endurance was going to get banned going forward, but it looks like the way that Nisei wants to deal with this is they want to deal with the late game inevitability of these cards like Rizeki and Pat Tap, as opposed to the new card, the shiny aggressive Endurance, which is also of course doing a lot, but now the idea is that Shapers are going to have to spend more time setting up and actually playing economy cards, not their one-stop solutions while they're running everywhere with their boat. And speaking about that, I'm really interested to see how the meta changes to deal with this. Mind you, Rizeki Pat Tap was everywhere, and it was representing a lot of economy cards, a lot of economy slots, and a lot of decks. So now we're gonna have to see Shapers actually spend clicks and time planning their economy. Teller Contract is still pretty good, but it is much more click intensive than a 1 install Rizeki. Aesop's Pawn Shop might also be the natural thing. We did see some Woo decks, Cabinets of Woo decks do well in the competitive recent season, but again, this is much more click intensive, and you have to plan your turn around. You can't be as aggressive as the Endurance stuff. On the criminal side, we might just see Chesva take that slot. And I do think a big part also about Rizeki being banned is we're going to see more decks have more MU that they might be interested to play with other tools. Criminal decks modernly were a bit restricted, where they were playing their breakers, 3 breakers generally, and then like 2 Rizekis, and that filled up their entire MU. So people just weren't playing with some of the other interesting non-breaker, non-Rizeki programs, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. Unfortunately, there are some casualties with Rizeki being banned and Pat Tap being banned, specifically mini factions. Adam and Sunny are so excited to have really powerful 1 cost, 1 influence, or not 1 cost, but 1 influence economic solutions, considering they have 25 influence to spend on all the non-Adam, non-Sunny factions. So this is unfortunately going to be a bit of a bummer. And on top of that, on the corp side, now that games might not have that sort of a real force to go faster, I think a big winner here is some of the asset-based lists. Cards like Maryland Campaign, these are so weak into Pat Tap, and Rizeki 2 to some extent, it just gave you a credit a turn. You could use that to trash stuff. But these sort of decks that could not trash a Pat Tap in the early game while still spamming assets, while still making sure they had that credit differential for things like hard-hitting news, are probably a bit more comfortable now, depending again on what the economy packages look. And that is it in terms of the 2209 changes. So they were still going to talk about all the other banned cards, but Rizeki and Pat Tap are out. So now economy should be a bit more interesting across the board. We'll see what that looks like. And of course, 419 is back. We'll go back to past Andre to wrap up the rest of the ban list. Another really strong criminal card on the ban list is Aaron Marrón, a very easy card to play. For only 2 influence and 2 credits, you get this unique connection. And it says whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, place 2 power counters on Aaron Marrón. Take that, Daig. And at instant speed, you can use these hosted power counters to either, or not either, but both, remove 1 tag and draw 1 card. But it's important to know that if you don't have a tag, you can still use his ability to draw a card, as long as some part of it is affecting the board state. This card was so easy to play and so good. You get this down in the early game, you're expecting to get at least 8, sometimes 10 card draw throughout this. If it came down in the mid game, it was still often worth installing. It depends how many points you have already, how many points the corp has. But this did so much. It was so easy to play. And on top of that, it kind of just entirely turned off certain corporation win conditions. With an Aaron Marrón on the table and with 2 influence that showed up in just about every faction, good luck playing a tagging archetype. As long as the runner respected that and kept a single counter on Aaron Marrón, not only were they dodging your tags, they were drawing cards at the same time. Even like any way to kill the runner was so much more difficult. Things like House of Knives. You know, any net damage archetype, you just kept a couple counters on Aaron Marrón and instant speed, you said, okay, before I access, draw 3. And that was wild. Of course, at that time too, criminals were consistently tagging themselves with cards like Account Siphon. So even on your own terms, you can ensure that you got a lot of value out of this card. This card was just way too good. It was too easy to play. It was showing up everywhere, and it was very easily invalidating multiple kind of archetypes, tag archetypes and damage-based archetypes. So Aaron Marrón got banned. I don't think this card can ever be legal again in the standard format. It's just doing way too much for way too little cost. And funny enough, Stoneship Chart Room is kind of reminding me of Aaron Marrón. This card is showing up as a 3-of. It's a very easy card to play in almost all Shaper decks, and it's having a large impact on how you can play boom decks or certain net damage decks into Shapers. It's kind of difficult, and this is nowhere near as powerful as Aaron Marrón, but it's kind of doing the same thing. A very easy on-tempo sort of card that allows you to dodge entire archetypes. At least it doesn't deal with tags. This is another day, another paycheck. It's banned simply because it's a current. It's a fun card. It's a snowball card. It kind of gets out of control if you can't deal with it. But unfortunately, this is a Sunny card. And you kind of hate to see mini faction cards get banned because those factions inherently don't have a lot of cards to play with. So Sunny is one fewer card out of the like dozen cards she has access to. So that's a bit unfortunate. Next up, Blue Moose. For 4 credits, you get this unique CD location, and it says when your turn begins, you can remove a card from your heap to gain 2 credits. You get this down on turn 1, you are making an immense amount of money. This was wild. I remember when this came out, there were decks we were going through replays and saying, wow, that Blue Moose actually gains you 20 credits throughout the game, which is a lot for a single install. The idea behind this card is ridiculously simple. You're playing events. Once you play events, they get trashed. And at that time, not a lot of decks were recurring events. There was not a lot of Steve Cambridge back there. So now your Sure Gamble eventually became a 6 credit card over time. Even cards like Daily Cast, stuff like that eventually got trashed. As long as you triggered your beginning of turn cards in the right order, your Daily Cast gave you 2, then it hit the heap, then you removed it for 2 credits. This is just way too much money on a card that the corporation struggles to interact with. You do see a lot of these like Econ over time cards getting potentially, I think, are being considered to put on a ban list. That's at least what the popular consensus is right now. But while Rizeki doesn't give you as much money, it does pay out just about as soon as a Blue Moose. And Blue Moose is twice as powerful without taking up any influence and without it taking up MU. So that's pretty wild. Yeah, this card got banned relatively quickly, but for a while, this was a huge boon to runner economies and was absolutely a massive amount of money for very little thought. It's funny how this is exactly the text for Refuge Campaign. Of course, Refuge Campaign is trashable. That's a big difference, but Blue Moose is buck wild. Next up, Clan Vengeance. And there's a couple cards that kind of fit this archetype. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but these are cards that got power counters that did something whenever the runner took damage. And we've seen other couple cards around that same time, which only triggered when the corporation did damage to the runner. These are cards that actually get value even when the runner damages themselves, which kind of flavorfully is a bit of a fail if you ask me. So whenever you suffered any amount of damage, you could put a power counter onto Clan Vengeance. It's not unique. You could have a bunch of these. And at instant speed, you can force the corp to trash cards from HQ. Technically, you were doing the trashing for each power counter on Clan Vengeance. So if you got this up to 5 power counters, at instant speed, you could pop this while running archives. The corporation just has to flush your whole hand out. And the value of this card greatly changed over time. When this came out, there was not a lot of ways to consistently damage yourself, so you had to go out of your way to build stuff. I love these sort of Tyler Durden Fight Club-esque decks that we played on stream. And the idea is that this deck would run Fisk Investment Seminar to force the corporation to draw 3 cards. So they were holding 8 cards on your turn. And then you would do enough damage to yourself by playing cards like Mad Dash. If you're playing against a Jinteki archetype that was doing like small bits of damage to you, that was pretty bad. And then you would Clan Vengeance away 8 cards from their hand at instant speed running archives. And that was a niche deck. It was pretty fun. I brought this to Store Championships and had big success with it. But later on, a year or so later, 0 was printed. This is currently a legal card. This also did get banned for a while, but has been unbanned relatively recently. And this is a card that Anarchs wanted to play regardless because it traded 1 net damage for 2 new cards and credit. And Anarchs often don't mind for their cards to enter their heap. This became a way to trigger your Clan Vengeance to power counter it on your own terms every single turn. And so this combo of Zero and Clan Vengeance was everywhere, and it was a bit nonsense. That was it. You played maybe 2 Clan Vengeance, some people played 3, you played 3 Zeros, you tried to get these down as soon as possible. And now, throughout the game, the corporation understood they're gonna have to throw out their whole hand. This forces them to jam into remote server a bit more aggressively. This almost entirely forced out any sort of combo corp decks. So if your corporation deck involved giving the runner a tag and then doing some tag punishment and doing something else throughout a turn, you know that you could never rely on holding those cards. On top of that, it had impacts on like weird fast advance decks. It was hard to do like install an agenda, biotic labor. Like people could interact with that and say like, stop, let me trash your hand before you do a second part of that combo. But it did so much to disrupt corporations, and it was impossible to interact with because all of this was on the runner's terms. So both of these cards ended up getting banned together. Now Zero has relatively recently been unbanned, but Clan Vengeance is probably going to stay banned forever while Zero is in the card pool. Again, if this card said only when the corporation does damage, he gets a power counter, that makes it a fair bit more balanced, but still largely unplayable, unfortunately. I don't mean still, but at that point it would be unplayable because I don't think that consistently happens. You do see other cards that do that. Speaking about damage stuff that's a bit overtuned, Salvage Vanitas Armory is one of the fastest bans in Netrunner. I actually thought that this card was banned before it was released. I'll show you in a second, but what this card does is at instant speed, it costs nothing, it's unique, but that doesn't really matter. The corp has to trash the top X cards of R&D, and X is equal to the amount of damage you have taken this turn. Now, this is the same sort of instance where it doesn't matter who's doing the damage. So we saw very quickly this deck, it's called Fight Club, that came out. And the idea is that on turn 6, turn 7, this deck could force the corporation to, at instant speed, trash the top 30 cards of their deck. This again played so many ways for the runner to have to draw cards and do enough damage to themselves. If you could take 10, 15 damage in a turn, and then it would just crank out a bunch of Salvage Vanitas Armories. And that was it. Corporation had to rip 30 off the top of R&D. They probably lose at that time. Whether you have to run to Axis with Hades Shard or not to run with Hades Shard, or whether they just milled out at that point, who knows? I never actually saw this deck in person because this is one of the decks. So this deck was published on 15th of September 2017, and just about 2 weeks later in September 27th, this was banned. So this was something that was kind of seen coming, unfortunately, but Salvage Vanitas Armory is probably one of those instances that wanted it, so it only cared if the corp did damage to the runner. It didn't have that text, and this card was banned so quickly. To date, I've never seen this combo, but people understood. It was pretty wild. Crowdfunding. This is one of those Magnum Opus cards that came out during the Magnum Opus. It was a champ card by Sam Swade. Sam Swade has now 2 champ cards, big deal as well. And this card, when installed for 0, gave you 3 credits over time, and kind of similar to Nico Campaign, when it was finished, you drew a card. But the big text here is at the bottom. When your turn ends, if you have made at least 3 successful runs this turn, you could reinstall any amount of copies of this from your heap. They just came back. And this was such a perfect tool for all those run-based criminals that wanted to get these down, get that cheap, good value, and then make a bunch of aggressive runs, and then this came back. And this kept coming back. It came back over and over again. It was hard to stop it. And this became this like unending economy engine. The fact that I could make 3 runs on a turn in the mid game and get 9 credits and 3 card draws from it was way too hard for the runners or for the corporations to interact with that. It was just so much money over time. And you saw that this showed up everywhere. Even for 3 influence, you saw a lot of decks playing 3 of them. You see Anarchs, even Apex could play this because it was virtual, and Shapers as well. So this was just a very popular card and it had to be banned out. It's wild. The economy of this card does in a lot of ways compare to the inevitability of cards like Rozeki, but this did end up getting banned out for being too powerful throughout the whole game. It was hard at that time to stop the runners from running 3 times. This is the employee strike. This is the other current that I think could have been banned back in the day. This one was neutral, but it did cost a single influence, and it says the corpse identity text box is blank. So you play this, and whatever your opponent, whatever cool deck they brought, and mind you, corp decks I think are generally much more contingent on using their corp ability than runners are as a whole. That was it. It was blank. They were no longer making any decisions, and their deck went from boring to dysfunctional. And that was the problem with this deck, is if you were brave enough to show up to an event with an ability like Jemison, which is really fun, but is 100% like it's necessary for your ability to be online for you to do anything cool, and then turn 1, someone plays an employee strike, you start to see the feast or famine, the answer or die sort of way that currents worked back then. And this was no fun. Honestly, this is the reason why you saw those 0-cost currents showing up in some lists, because those lists just needed a cheap way to turn off the employee strike, because if the employee strike happened and you couldn't clear it, you've lost the game on the spot. And not only did you lose the game, the way you're going to lose the game is going to be really boring when you stop making interesting decisions and all your cards become kind of bad. Yeah, this was the pinnacle of like currents being really unfun. I think this ability, a text box is blank, that's not even fun for anyone. I'm aware it's a powerful effect and runners wanted to play this. This card was banned, restricted. There's a lot of ways that this was hit over time. But oh my God, I'm so glad this ability is not in the game. This is a weird one. This is probably one of the strangest cards to look at and be like, wait, why is that banned? And this gives you a really important lesson about Netrunner. When any time a card says the word whenever, really look at it, because that card can be broken. Whenever is such a strong clause. There's so many cards, economy cards, value cards that say first time per turn or once a turn. When they say whenever, you can maybe do something a bit best with them. This is GPI net tap. It was hardware that you could install, and it says whenever you approach a piece of ice, you may expose it, and then you may trash GPI net tap to jack out. That's not a very flashy ability. In fact, there was a card like this back in the day called Snitch, which had a pretty similar effect. You can expose and then jack out. You didn't have to trash it though. This card saw very little to no play. But the big difference between GPI net tap, it's a piece of hardware, so it doesn't take up any MU, and it's not unique. So you could go ahead and install 3 GPI net tap. And you might think, why would I want to do that? Well, the big reason is if I run into an unresed ice and I have an Amakua, I can expose it once, get a power counter, expose it twice, get a power counter, expose it the third time, get a power counter. And suddenly it was really hard to keep an Amakua down as long as you had unresed ice. Now this comboed with other cards that said whenever on them, cards like Zamba. Zamba says whenever a corp card is exposed, you can gain a credit. So now anytime you run to an unresed ice, you're gaining 3 power counters on your, or virus counters on your Amakua, and you're gaining 3 credits. And this is not, again, first ice per turn. This is whenever. So if there's 3 ice in a row, they're all unresed. That's 9 credits and 9 counters on your Amakua. Now, of course, if the ice is resed, you can't expose it. And that's where the D-res package came in. This is Tug to Guts, the recent Euro Africa Continental Champions deck that also played a couple D-res cards. So with Rubicon Switch, as long as you had the credits, you could force the corp to D-res their cards. And then you had everything here working together. 3 Amakua, 2 Zamba, 3 GPI net tap. And you have something that's inherently quite gross. And this all came down to the fact that this card says whenever, most of these cards say whenever, and a lot of these cards should have been unique and they weren't. And that was the package. This wasn't like an overwhelming deck that was a large part of the meta, but it was a deck that certain people were playing with huge success. And the ban list team at the time understood that this probably shouldn't exist, because if this does catch on, it's really not fun. Being punished to inherently run ice in your corp deck is a problem. And so all this stuff got banned. There's a lot of people that never saw this card see a table and are going to be very confused why this is on the list. Next up, government investigations. It's a current. It's a terrible current. I've never seen this see play. I can not even think of a meta where this is going to be necessary, let alone better than any of the other currents, but it's banned. The art's cool. You see 2 characters from the game. Interdiction, though, this was actually a neutral current that did see some amount of play. It's 1 cost. Again, a lot of shapers specifically that didn't have any good in-faction currents would play Interdiction as a way just to be able to turn off scarcity of resources. That was the thing you had to worry about. And this says that the corp cannot res non-ice cards during the runner's turn. So this is one of the sort of surprise turn it's played matters corp currents, or runner currents, excuse me. The idea is that corporations were playing defensive upgrades, and a lot of times they didn't want to go out of their way to res these before they needed to. Not only does it give information, but it makes them weaker to some certain other runner cards. But the idea is that if the corporation is trying to score an agenda in a remote server with a defensive upgrade, you could just slap down the interdiction and suddenly their plans are foiled. You just have to deal with the ice and that's it. It was another cool way to play this, and so that the corporation couldn't res their spin doctor equivalent, and you could run archives and steal some agendas. I never loved cards like this. It's the sort of thing where once you get burned by it, like, you don't know, are you just pre-resing your stuff for fun? But again, I didn't find it to be pretty fun. It was just kind of I gotcha, that's it. And it usually did enough the turn it was played, but a lot of times it was played just to turn off currents. An important thing about this card, it says you cannot res non-ice cards during the runner's turn, but this is a good learning opportunity. There is a paid ability window on the corporation's turn before the start of their turn trigger. So if someone did play an interdiction and you had a Nico campaign unresed, you are still able to res it on the corp's turn before the corp start a turn trigger to get the money off of it. Very important to know. You do not have to res stuff on the runner's turn to get value off of them. Next up is Lamb. And Lamb is a series of 2 shaper breakers that both cost 2 MU that came out in the Katara cycle. And Lamb is very similar. Again, Ngolo was its counterpart. And while Ngolo could pay 2 credits to paint something into a code gate, Lamb could pay 2 credits to make anything a barrier. And this card actually was much more common at the time for a couple reasons. It's a bit cheaper, but it also broke all subroutines for 2 credits. That was actually a pretty valuable valuable effect at the time. And it also did 3 credits for +3 strength. So there was almost no ice in the format that this couldn't break entirely for 7 credits. To boost once, to break all subroutines, and of course to paint it for a barrier. This card showed up in a couple interesting archetypes. This is a Stabby Max deck. It took first at this Bristol Store Championship. The idea is that this was a max deck that ran a single copy of Lamb, but it would run 3 knifed. And while Max was at the end of her deck, she could recur these knives over and over again. And if you can go out of your way to make every single ice a barrier, you can trash every single ice you want. And there's another list where you see the 3 of crowdfunding, where if you're trashing ice you're running, you're getting infinite money into the late game. Another big interaction with Lamb that made it get banned was Surfer. And man, I did not like these decks. Surfer was a very powerful Anarch program that allowed you to swap a barrier you're currently encountering with the card behind it, and you followed it as it went down the server. So if you ran into a 3-ice server and you had Surfer and you had Lamb, you can make the thing a barrier and then just surf 2 credits until you were in. So any stack of ice could get through for the Lamb break, the Lamb paint, and then some amount of credit surfing. And it started making corp ice positioning and ice types and all that fun stuff not matter when things were being surfed through for 2 credits. Surfer never hit like mass saturation in the standard card pool, but it was a not fun interaction. So currently Lamb is banned while you can still play in Golo. I do think modernly you could consider unbanning Lamb. It's still very powerful. Right now, Shaper has access to Endurance, the boat that is another way to cheat through ice without having solutions, with the way that Ngolo used to be played a bit more consistently. And I think without Knifed in the format, it's rotated. Without Surfer, it's rotated. You could consider potentially unbanning Lamb. I'm going to say that, and then eventually you'll see what the problems are with having too many of these like one single ways to deal with multiple ice in a single run things. But yeah, maybe it could be unbanned. Next up is Liza. Liza is the Rain and Reverie criminal runner. Love the flavor on this thing. The prominent legislator. The first time you run a central server each turn, you draw 2 cards, but you're forced to take a tag as well. 50 deck size means that FFG thought this was a strong ability, and rightfully so. So you get a bit of deck inconsistency to balance that out. And Liza was the best criminal at the time to play the tag me archetype. An archetype of a runner who wants to go out of the way to get as many tags as they could as quickly as they could to close the game out. And this deck was really, really powerful for a narrow window before Liza got banned out. Once again, this is Whiteblade, Eric, you saw from a lot of the other stuff we talked about earlier. And this is a Liza Talking Thunder deck. You'd go out, you get as much tags as you can, you get as much card draw as you can, and then you can win the game off of playing something like Counter Surveillance. This allows you to see 10, 12 cards off the top of R&D based off of how many tags you have, and this was doing really quite well. On top of that, in the same month, if I'm not mistaken, this exact same sort of archetype came first and second at the UK Nationals. It's a very similar deck list. So not only was his archetype very strong, just the playstyle was inherently a bit polarizing. The weakness to Liza's free card draw is the tags that she was gaining, but there's just inherently a lot of factions that can't interact with those tags in any meaningful way. We were not at the point where you're putting tag punishment in your Jinteki or your HB deck. So while you're playing against NBN that had tag punishment cards, the match was a bit more interesting, but against HB, it was just gas all the time. And so I never loved this sort of tag me design. There's also another tag me card that was banned. It was banned before the Liza Talking Thunder ban, and that was Mars for Martians. For 0 cost as a priority, first click, I totally forget that this text said draw 1 card for each installed clan resource. That never really mattered. The part that did matter was gain 1 credit for each tag you have. And this kind of similarly to the mass commercialization on the corporation side, it's just massive amount of economy that you inherently didn't have a way to interact with. If the runner had 18 tags, they just played this for a click and got 18 credits. And that's exactly all the money they needed to play their win condition Counter Surveillance, where you need money equal to the amount of tags you had. So yeah, that was rough. And Mars for Martians got banned first for being massively unable to be interacted with. You can't untag the runner. Mind you, at the time too, a lot of the tag punishment like closed accounts was useless against a Mars for Martians. But this got banned first, and then eventually Liza got banned as well. And the tag archetype modernly, I think, is actually still playable, especially because the high profile target got recently banned. There's fewer cards that deal with this sort of archetype, but at least you're not getting the free card draw and setting up like 5 to 6 times as fast with all of those free cards. Next up, we have an Anarch Current. This is Rumor Mill. This was a very powerful card for a window, and it was unrestricted, unbanned for a while, and nobody really played it. But the text box of each unique non-region asset and upgrade is blank. It's also card art that's been behind me for a couple years. This is Princess Space Kitten. So this card was inherently very powerful. Modernly, you could play this as a current and it just goes ahead and blanks the runner's cards, or sorry, the corporation's cards. Cards like Anoetic Void, cards like Manigar and Skunkworks, pretty popular cards that you use to protect agendas in your remote server are now just entirely blank. And while I do think there are some cards in Netrunner modernly that blank cards that are interesting, this is not one of them. Because the corporation just can't interact with this meaningfully. Their cards are just blank constantly, and it's just not fun. Your deck falls apart if you rely too heavily on these cards. Now, Rumor Mill was powerful for a bit. Again, when it was available again for the card pool, a lot of people didn't like spending time playing this as opposed to some of the other currents. But again, overall, It's a card that people had strong opinions on, but it's currently banned because it's just a current. Talking about cards like this, we do have Modernly Light the Fire, which is kind of a reimagining, so in some ways, of this sort of rumor mill, but it's a bit more interactive, a bit more exciting, and I like this design a heck of a lot better. Next, System Outage. This is an Anarch current. It's very niche. It punishes the corporation for drawing more than just a mandatory draw. Again, it's a current, it's banned, but it was some fun niche decks that played Equivocation to force the corp to draw a lot and bankrupt them at the same time. It was kind of fun. This is System Seizure, a Shaper current. Classically, Shaper currents weren't ever that good, and this one allows your icebreakers to retain strength during a run. It's an ability that's kind of niche. The faction's already pretty good at dealing with ice, so this was never exactly necessary, but you see how it could work with cards like Angola or Lamb. Didn't see a lot of play, but as a zero cost in faction current, some people would consider it. And Temujin Contract, this is such a wild card. It's a criminal card. For 4 credits, it's unique. You put one of these down and you put 20 credits on it. That's actually the most credits on a single installed card, if I'm not mistaken. And you chose a server and you marked it as a Temujin server. And then anytime you made a successful run on that server, you got 4 credits off of this thing. So you just got 5 runs. And often the way that this was played, specifically on first turn, you would install it. You would mark archives if it was uniced usually, or you'd mark R&D or HQ, whatever was not iced, and you would just run it 3 times. So you get this down, you pay 4, you get 12 credits out of it. So on whole, you just traded your whole turn for 8 credits. And that is good enough. Day Job has existed. It's been a marginally playable standard card and allowed you just to spend your whole turn to get 8 credits, no runs necessary. And Temujin, not only were you getting 8 credits on your first turn, you're setting up 8 more credits for another turn while you got potentially more value running RD or running archives, whatever you've marked. On top of that, you could play run events that gave you money. This is just an absurd amount of economies on a 2 influence card, so this thing showed up everywhere. It was very common for people to try and empty this turn 1, and then since then, it's also into the late game. Now when you're running HQ and gaining 4 credits back, like a lot of times you were making money on the run. Criminals and Anarchs at the time had a lot of run-based economy decks that really valued this, and this was just way too much money. You see a modern version of this with Red Team, which is a lot more restrictive of how you can get the money off of it. You can't empty it in 1 turn. You can't play it with run events. And this is the modern version. And in the standard card pool, this sees just about 0 play. So you see where this was rained back on. But this is one of the most ludicrous economy cards ever printed in Netrunner. And finally, if I'm not mistaken, this is Cipher. An Anarch console that cost 5, gave you 2 MU, which is not a bad start. And it said once per turn, you can take an ice that you're encountering and reduce its strength to 0. For that massive ability, the downside was that you reduce your maximum hand size by 1. So you're not taking random damage, you're just going down to 4 cards of your choice. And this card costs a single influence. I hope it's pretty obvious why this is so massively strong. Being able to run in 1 big ice a turn and changing it from 6 strength potentially to 0 strength is so much economy. That could be the difference between you saving 6 credits in potential situations or not being able to break at all. Back then too, there was a lot more Anarchs running what was called the fixed strength breaker set. So these were breakers that were really efficient, but struggled. They inherently could not boost their strength. So the idea is that if you can run through a 5 or 6 strength code gate and break it for 0, you see the amount of money you're getting off Cipher in a single turn. It's actually not impossible to get 5 credits back. On top of that, you had other ways like Atman and 0 would be just like a panic button. Get an Atman 0, you could always face check into things and be safe. And that was massively powerful. This is a really good deck. First place at a store championship, and you see it's running 3 Cipher. It's running some of those fixed strength breakers and of course 2 Temujin Contract, because why not run, get more money while doing all this stuff at the same time? But I think the worst interaction with Cipher was the way that it worked with Parasite. Parasite is what the old Chisel used to be. Chisel would work the same way right now. But once this was installed on an ice and that ice was at 0 credits, that ice got trashed. So install a Parasite on an ice, run, Cipher the card, and then it's instantly trashed, regardless of how much money the corporation spent on it. And in Shaper, you could do so much of that at instant speed. Self-modifying code allows you to install the Parasite at instant speed from your deck, and Simulchip or Clone Chip at the time allows you to play it over and over again. And so you saw Shaper decks that never broke any pieces of ice because they never needed to. And this card was massively powerful for 5 cost, for 1 influence. This is one of the cards that I think was the most out of line for how strong it was, for how little influence it was, and the impact it had. In fact, there's a video you can find on this channel just entitled Cipher, where like seemingly 12-year-old me complains about it a bit and talks about the discussion. This card being so ubiquitous, it was being seen in every single faction, really changed the idea that corporations did not want to spend a lot of money on ice when they understood all their ice could be trashed at instant speed or could be broken for pennies with some of the best breakers in the game. And that's obviously not healthy. And so Cipher was banned relatively quickly, if I'm not mistaken. But this console can never be unbanned. I don't see a way that it could. This ability is so strong. And the cost associated with it, like forehand size does not matter in just about any ways. There's like no common played card that can flatline a runner on 5 cards in hand or on 4 cards in hand that can't on 5 cards in hand. So yeah, Sifra is wild. And that's it. That is the entire ban list. Mind you, that Nisei is just about going to announce a new ban list for Worlds coming up, 2022 Worlds in Toronto. So we'll see a new ban list in about a week or so. Does that invalidate this entire video? In some ways, maybe, but I think the historical relevance of what cards have been banned for reasons, and we're going to see more cards enter this list, hopefully some cards leave it as well, should give you an idea of how this works. If you are playing Startup and you're a bit nervous of getting into Standard, you can see that there's actually a lot of time and effort curating the Standard format to make sure that the stuff that you're playing, the format you're playing, is actually quite fun. That's a big difference when Startup, where in Startup there's no ban list, so a lot of the really, really strong cards are unbanned in Startup, but we can't play with them in Standard, so yeah, take from that what you will. But that is it. I'd love to hear your feedback on this sort of video. Of course, if there's certain cards, certain interactions that you think I missed that are reasons why this ended up on the ban list, I'd love to hear some of your experiences too with some of these cards and archetypes before they were banned. And I'd love to hear also what kind of cards you think could come off this list, because I think there are a couple candidates, and I do like the fact that Nisei does go out of their way to try and unban cards from time to shake up the meta. And of course, here on the Metropole Grid, we just recently opened a Patreon account. And if you'd like to support this channel and the content we make, any amount of contribution is massively appreciated. And I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who's already become a patron. And I'm going to read out the names as of recording date for all patrons of the Sure Gamble tier and above. And of course, for our Daily Cast patrons, your contribution is immensely appreciated as well. So huge shout out off the top. From the date of recorded to Taekwondo, Sebastian Keinzel, Spooky Noises, Jay Verrill, Chris Mitchell, Matt Conduit, Lee Butler, James Coulson Wright, Joe T, Zach Cruz, Nathan Hutner, Matthew Shanuel, Elliot Mauby, Jalen Horm, Daniel Cook, Spray, Arthur Pitt, Hanny Habisha, Levy Corner, Lucas, Encoder, Clement Marshall, Nathan Durant, Pedrego Royce, Stefan Primal, Josie Barron, Michaelis Migos, PR Small, Ewan Milne, Jeff Bennett, Awesome Case, Sebastian Colorado, New Object, Sven Zavin, Asfa Channel, Andrew Jolly, Shane Lilly, Alec, Chris, Cror, Sebastian Koch, Kat Shen, Ken Elwin, Astrolad, Izzy Stardust, Andrew Robertson, Phil Ulrich, and Dan Bouchard. Thank you so much for contributing to the channel. Massively appreciated, and we'll catch you in the next one. Yeah.